thank you all for joining us this afternoon, despite the wonderful weather outside. It's good to see everybody. We're very fortunate today to have this opportunity to be joined by Professor Paal Sigurd Hilde, who is Professor of War Studies at the Institute for Defence Studies, which is part of the Norwegian Defence University College. Professor Hilde earned his DPhil at the University of Oxford in 2003, and he works mainly on Norwegian security and defense, NATO and Arctic security. He's also worked on policy planning and NATO at the Norwegian Ministry of Defence, led the secretariat of 2 government-appointed commissions, and among other things, is the inaugural Norway Chair at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. So EETN is very happy and fortunate to welcome Professor Hilde to talk to us today on the topic of title slide, NATO and the Arctic. Okay, good. Professor Hilde, please.
Thank you, Paul. Paul and I studied together, so that's why now. Professor, good, yeah. Well, thank you for sort of having me, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been here now for a week with sort of different seminars and workshops, etc. And this is much more fun if we interact, if not sort of ask questions while I'm speaking. Just raise your hand, and those online, if someone can see the chat or something, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so just feel free to either just sort of send a question in the chat, or just sort of raise your hand and speak out, because I can talk for hours, but that's not so fun either for you or me. So, but anyway, what I'm going to do is to sort of, as it says on the slide, talk a little bit about sort of NATO and the role of the Arctic, or the view of the Arctic in the alliance. Mainly historical, but also something about sort of what can be done ahead. The background for first of all, as in the picture there shows Norwegian P3C, which in Canada is called the CP-140 Aurora, which is a maritime surveillance aircraft, and a Russian Akula 2 submarine, probably the K-157 Viper. And the picture is not coincidental. It's basically sort of reflects the main importance of the Northern Europe, or the European part of the Arctic, for NATO, as I'll come back to. But the background for why, let's see. There we go, that worked. The background for the talk is, where the idea came from, was this changing view in Canada on sort of NATO in the Arctic. This is the traditional view, as in NATO is not needed in the North American Arctic. And I won't go into sort of any kind of advanced explanations of why Canadian policy has been like that. There are other people who know that much better than me. So I'll give a much broader picture, and one tied more to sort of the view in NATO as an alliance, or the collective view there. But one obvious sort of explanation for the Canadian position has always been its relations to the United States, both in a good way, and through the very close and fruitful relationship in NORAD, as a North American Air Defense cooperation there. But also obviously that the United States has been a traditional challenger for Canada, in the sense, for instance, of the view of what is Canada terms the internal waters of the Northwest Passage, but which, as in the US, claims are international straits, where its naval vessels, for instance, can sail through without any interference from the Canadian side. Now, what has happened is this, as in that you've had seen Canada now more recently come out and wanting more NATO in the Arctic. This is from the Globe and Mail recently. And again, now I won't go and try any kind of sort of advanced explanations for that, but as I'll get to in the end, I imagine, well, I think that sort of the relationship to the United States, again, is very important for this policy change. Okay, what I'll do in the lecture is to sort of look at a few things, looking back into history, and then start off with a bit of organization, then the sort of different perspectives on military threats and tasks in the European part of NATO and the North American part of NATO. I'll talk a little bit about NATO in the High North, which is basically the period from 2008-9, when the Arctic came back, and that's sort of the Arctic Renaissance bit, where Canada was very reluctant to engage NATO in the Arctic, and thus this term, the High North, came up. And I'll explain that a bit better. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about if allies, as the NATO allies, all of us are serious about engaging NATO in the Arctic, there are some obvious things that can be done. And as I said, please do ask questions while I talk. It's more fun than just me standing here talking. Okay? All good? Then we continue. So let's start off with a bit of history. When NATO was founded in April 1949, there wasn't any kind of centralized sort of organization, either on the civilian side or the military side. What the Allies did create were 5 regional planning groups, as you can see here. There's the 3 in Europe, Northern, Western, and Southern Europe and Mediterranean region planning groups, the North Atlantic one, and 1 Canada-US. The sort of intention of these groups were to basically to have the countries in the region get together and discuss deterrence and defense needs and sort of synchronize the build-up in Europe of their armed forces after the Second World War, and sort of in those countries who weren't occupied, as in Britain and Canada and the United States, the development of their armed forces and sort of how synergies could be sort of used. But quite quickly in summer 1950, when the Korean War started, Allies decided that this is sort of a part of a bigger communist offensive, and Western Europe might be the next target for communist expansion. So they decided there's a need to integrate our defense much closer than we have so far. So what then happened was that they, in the autumn of 1950, decided to create an integrated command structure in NATO. And as you could see from the change on the slide here now, basically it was the 3 European regional planning groups that became Allied Command Europe, which was sort of led by the most famous NATO commander as a secure Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And then slightly later, Allied Command Atlantic was created. The Canada-United States Regional Planning Group remained separate. It never became part of the command structure. So basically what you had was the development of a NATO area responsibility and a NORAD, after a while, NORAD area responsibility. So deterrence and defense in North America has never been a core mission in NATO. And this is the historical or organizational sort of explanation for it. Now, since I will be using the word or term High North, I'll just sort of point out that generally today, this is not a Cold War term, but this is sort of the High North in a NATO setting. And I'll come back to that closer, more detailed later on. Okay, so that's the organizational piece. As in develop command structure, develop NATO into an alliance that had its focus on Europe and on the European part of the Arctic, in as much as it had any focus on the Arctic at all. Next, a little bit about threats. The first time the Arctic gained strategic military significance was during the Cold War. And it's particularly from the late 1950s with the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range bombers that could fly directly from the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other, which meant that given that sort of the shortest route between the superpowers was through the Arctic, the air and space above the Arctic became strategically important. Now, as a consequence of this, one saw the development of early warning radar sites on both sides. I've just here marked the North American side, and this is obviously a very important part of Canadian history with the distant early warning line and various installations in the north of Canada. And the most famous of these radars obviously is the Thule radar, or the Pacific Space Base as it's called now, that on Greenland. And this significance of the Arctic continues to be relevant today. And it's even not just relevant for missiles that sort of were to come from Russia, but also from North Korea down here, and even Iran missiles fired from there would also go, because of the Earth being a globe, would have trajectories that would come up through the north if they were directed at the North American continent. So, for instance, the Pacific radar is still very, very relevant for these. And it's not a coincidence that the missile interceptors in the US are at Fort Greely in Alaska, because missiles from North Korea or potentially China would come up through there. So that's one part, and this is sort of the main significance of the Arctic, but it had nothing to do with NATO, or very marginally to do with NATO. This was the Soviet Union directly with the US, with Canada as a sort of the supporter in a sense, or the basing area for a lot of the installations that were relevant for this hemispheric defense of North America. NATO wasn't involved in that almost at all. A second part of the significance of the Arctic is tied to this. And the little maps here, what they show is the increasing range of missiles on ballistic, as in submarines, strategic submarines with ballistic missiles. So the early models, top left corner here on the slide, they had a very short range. Basically, the submarines had to go to the east and west coast of North America and fire their missiles from there because they couldn't go further. Whereas if you move to the late 1980s, Delta IV and Typhoon submarines, they had missiles that could be fired from the Arctic all the way to North America. And this led to a situation where you saw the development of something called the bastion concept, tied to this gentleman there, Fleet Admiral Gorshkov, who's sort of seen as the father of this concept, or the architect of this concept. And basically the thinking was that the strategic submarines would stay up in the Arctic Ocean and hide under the ice, where they're harder to spot, particularly obviously with aerial assets. And then they would, in case of war, come out and then sort of break through the ice, or come out from under the ice and then fire their missiles towards the enemy. And then they would be protected by the Northern Fleet in particular, that would sort of try and keep sea control of us and keep full control in the area up in the Arctic Sea and Barents Sea and beyond, and then deny NATO and particularly US Navy from operating in the northern parts in the Norwegian Sea and northern parts of the North Atlantic. Also, this is very relevant today, just sort of the new types of submarines that have come to. Again, this has very little to do with NATO. This is mainly North American sort of continental defense and the US Navy trying to keep track of these. So there's a lot of intelligence and surveillance going on, and both further up in the Arctic Ocean, but also in the North Sea, tied to this. But again, it's mainly US with some partners, Britain, partly France, and due to geography also Norway. What was relevant from a NATO perspective was something else. Everyone who's read sort of history, and particularly history of World War I and World War II, will know of the significance of the sea lines communication across the Atlantic. Now, initially in the Cold War, these were not that important, because in the 1950s and up into the early 1960s, any war between the Soviet Union, later Warsaw Pact, and NATO would have been a nuclear war, as in nuclear weapons would have been used from the start. And given that, no one expected a war to last more than a few weeks. As in NATO's strategy at the time, officially from 1957, was that any attack on NATO would be answered by pressing the big red button and basically obliterating the Soviet Union. Obviously, there was a sort of credibility question there, and that led to that strategy to be changed quite quickly. But the point was that given that war would be short, you wouldn't need much reinforcements and resupplies across the Atlantic. From 1960s, and particularly from 1968, when NATO changes its strategy to what is called flexible response, where sort of any attack or smaller attacks would have been met by conventional force before then gradually escalating, then suddenly these sea lines of communication came back again became important. Now that coincided with the growth of the Soviet Navy from the 1960s. And again, as you can see from the slide, for obvious geographic reasons, the Northern Fleet became the most important fleet. As in the two other fleets that the Soviet Union and today Russia has in the European part are the Baltic fleets and Black Sea fleets. But these have to pass through straits, as in the Danish Straits or the Dardanelles, and even out through the Gibraltar Straits to access the North Atlantic. Whereas from the kind of peninsula, the Soviet fleet and now Russia's fleet has more or less free access to the North Atlantic. And it's important to remember here that that part of the Arctic Ocean is not icebound, as in there is very little ice up there and now basically nothing. So you have free access to the North Atlantic year round, unlike in the Canadian Arctic where it's frozen for much of the year. So this became the main emphasis in NATO. This is where NATO countries and NATO navies in particular, obviously, cooperated very closely. And the little blue thing you see there, the GIUK, as in the Greenland, Ice and the UK, GAP was the main forward line of defense for NATO during the Cold War, and to some extent and purposes is still today. And you can see why if you look closely. If you look up where it says Northern Fleet and the Barents Sea, it's very shallow. So up there it's quite easy to keep track of submarines and sort of other things, because when the shallow water, it's easier. If they get into the Norwegian Sea, then they're harder to keep track of because it's really deep. You can see that with the darker blue color. And then they can move more or less sort of undetected until they come down to the island chains stretching basically from Greenland to the United Kingdom, where it's again pretty shallow and then easier to see them. And then if you can see them, you can also stop them. So this is the sort of significance of the European part of the Arctic for NATO traditionally, and it is still today, just again with new submarines. So it took, yes, go ahead, Sean.
I just had a quick question concerning the route that you've displayed there with the Northern Fleet. So you mentioned that right now there isn't much ice there, but I was just wondering, are there now some data demonstrating how many months of the year this area is covered, or at least part of that area is covered by ice?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you go, I need something to point with. I'm not tall enough. Anyway, I've done. If you go up to Svalbard, you see Svalbard, yeah. Above Svalbard, north of Svalbard, you'll still get ice, and that's traditionally ice clad as well. And the ice will come down along the coast of Greenland, but on the Norwegian side, this side, there is no ice. There never has been. You have to go very far back into history. So going to Murmansk is not a problem. It's only if you get into the Murmansk fjord in winter, then yes, there'll be ice, but it'll probably be very thin ice, so it's not a problem to break it and get out. But in the water, in most of the, basically most of the Barents Sea will be ice-free in winter.
Entire year.
Yeah. So okay, so we talked about organization, we talked about threats. And both an organization and the threat picture is very different from the European part of the Arctic and the North American part of the Arctic. And that sort of serves to explain why the North American part has never been really part of the core thinking in NATO. Now, zoom forward to the end of the Cold War. And this all sort of becomes a bit much less interesting. The threat from, as in the Soviet Union, is dissolved, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved, and new tasks sort of emerged. First in the Western Balkans, Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and then Iraq and Afghanistan for NATO in the 2000s. And no one was really thinking about sort of, oh, that Russia might attack us for a very long time. Then something happened, and that's the sort of next step in our sort of little lecture here. In the early 2000s, international attention again returned to the Arctic, and there were two key drivers. I'm only shown here one here, but one was expectation to find a lot of oil and gas and other resources in the Arctic. And the second one is the picture there as an expectation that the melting ice and sea ice would open up for new shipping routes through the Arctic. Now, I won't go into sort of how this was been exaggerated a lot, as at this time, 2007, 8, 9, 10, there were a lot of expectations that the sort of Northern Sea route would replace the Suez Canal, which is complete nonsense. It will never, probably, for many, many reasons. But still, there was a big sort of attention to this. And this fellow here, now I suddenly forgot his name, but Chilingarov, Artur Chilingarov. He was a Russian scientist and a member of the Russian Duma. And he, in late July, early August 2007, went up to the North Pole and then sent a submersible down and planted a little sort of titanium Russian flag there. And while Russia has never said that that constituted any kind of international legal act, it was interpreted to do that. And I remember that the Canadian Minister of Defence at the time, Mackay, he was out saying basically, this is not the 17th century. You cannot claim land by planting flags. So he got a lot of, in a sense, undeserved attention, but it was a sign that triggered this notion of a great power race for the Arctic, that the great powers would try and go up there and claim the resources that were in the region. And that, again, this economic interest, but also this threat of conflict, led a lot of countries to develop Arctic strategies. And Canada, in 2010, for instance, came on with its first statement on Canada's Arctic foreign policy. The other on the screen here, a Norwegian one, and the US one from 2009. Now, also in NATO, suddenly this triggered attention. And started really in 2008, where work in the staffs, both in the command structure, but also at NATO headquarters, they came to the conclusion we have to do something about the Arctic as well, because there's now so much attention. But they couldn't really agree with the nations. But what did happen was this: in January, in 2009, there was a seminar on Iceland on security prospects in the High North that was jointly organized by the NATO Defence College and the government of Iceland. After that, there was a discussion in the run-up to the summit that was held in April of 2009. There was the 60th anniversary summit in Kiel, Strasbourg, both on the German and French side of the border, to have some language on the Arctic and developments in the Arctic. And Iceland and Norway wanted to have 2 paragraphs about that, and talking about the challenges in the Arctic and the changes. But no, the Canadian government, Harper government, came out against that and said, no, we're not going to talk about the Arctic. We can have something about the High North. And that was all that was said in that declaration, summit declaration on developments in the High North, it says. International attention, welcome the initiative for Iceland, hosting a seminar. That was basically it. And from then, Canada had this position that we're not going to talk about the Arctic in NATO. Then things started happening again. First one was the start of the Russian, or the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the annexation of Crimea and the involvement in the Donbass in 2014. In NATO, that was a sea change in a sense, in that it triggered the start with the Wales summit in September 2014 of a massive reconfiguration of NATO that has basically continued until today, from operations out of area back towards deterrence and defense in the North Atlantic area. And one part of that was the stationing in 2016 of forward land forces in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. In February 2022, this was expanded, and there are 4 more groups in the form of southernmost as an allied countries, as in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. But I don't have to show that, because the point here was that particularly the Baltic states, they wanted brigades stationed in their countries, as in big formations, big land formations, because they very small countries, and there were big Russian forces on the other side of the border, so they were afraid that you could see a very quick Russian attack where Russia would occupy those countries and then say, okay, try to take them back, we'll send nuclear weapons at you. So they wanted big land forces. There was no interest in NATO to sort of fund that, because it would be very expensive to have brigades there. And also a lot of countries, including, for instance, Germany, was still thinking that we should not unnecessarily provoke Russia. There are sort of deeper explanation I won't spend time on, but these are sort of somewhat simplified, the explanations. So what was decided in the end was to have small battalion-sized sort of multinational battle groups in those three countries with lots of participants. This is from 2021. You can see there are lots of flanks here. And the point of these forces were basically to be a tripwire. Get as many forces as possible from as many NATO countries as possible forward. And if there is an attack, Russia would be killing soldiers from a range of NATO countries, making it sort of much more likely that all of these and the whole of NATO would be involved in the conflict. Now, the Baltic states accepted this on one condition, and that was that if there's increased tension or if there is a war or conflict, then these forces need to be reinforced very, very quickly and then resupplied. And this led, that attention was directed back at this. The need to ability to bring forces from North America to Europe, and then from the west coast of Europe to the Baltic states and Poland. And in 2018, NATO created two new commands with this purpose. One was Joint Force Command Norfolk. I'll come back to that. And the second one is this JSEC, it's called Joint Security and Enablement Command, which is in Germany, in Ulm. Whereas Norfolk was responsible for securing the sea lines of communication across the Atlantic, then JSEC is responsible for coordinating the movement across the European continent. Yeah. Moving further, in 2022, NATO came up for the first time since 2010. NATO came with a new strategic concept, and the strategic concept is has become, since the end of the Cold War, a very key document in sort of defining what NATO's mission or what its sort of tasks is. So it is a very important document. And in 2022, there was still very little about the High North, nothing about the Arctic. You can see long text. The point is this High North, that there is a threat emerging from the High North, Russian capability to disrupt Allied reinforcements and freedom of navigation across the North Atlantic. That was sort of the formulation that Allies could agree on. So still in 22, there was very little about the Arctic in the negotiated text in NATO. What did happen was that from 2022, you also got something called a climate change and security impact assessment. And these are not really sort of fully negotiated texts. They're developed by NATO staff and then sort of okayed by the delegations. And here you see an increasing number of mentions of the word Arctic. Mentioned once in 2022, 24 in 2023, and 42 times in 2024. So these are the NATO documents where you find the word the Arctic the most. Now, in there wasn't any security, climate change and security impacts assessment in 2025, and the reason why is that the United States does not like the word climate change, so they couldn't agree on having a report like that. But anyway, this is sort of shows a change in the sense that it's becoming acceptable to use the word Arctic also in NATO. Now to sort of prospects and more recent changes. This has been a traditional picture in the Arctic, where the flags are the countries that are members of the Arctic Council, and generally those sort of who are considered the Arctic states. There are 5 coastal states, as you can see, the innermost string here, as in Canada, United States, Denmark / Greenland, Norway, and Russia. And then I should have added Iceland. I've got Iceland here, but it's Finland, Sweden, and Iceland are the 3 other members of the Arctic Council that are not coastal states, including Iceland. 5 of the countries in in the Arctic Council and sort of in Arctic affairs in general were NATO members until Sweden and Finland joined in 2023 and 2024. So now you have a situation where you have all the Arctic countries, all Arctic 7 as they call in NATO, together in the alliance. And this opens for both as in many things, but also sort of policy discussions about NATO, the security in the Arctic in a completely different way than it was possible before. Because now they can do it at the classified level as well. Because Finland and Sweden are now in the good group in NATO, and they can sort of classify things using NATO classifications. That makes it much easier to talk about difficult topics among those countries. Then Trump becomes president, and it does make things much more difficult. My initial thought when Trump started talking in spring about sort of taking control of Greenland was that that's the end of any Arctic discussion in NATO. Denmark is not going to be willing to talk about the Arctic in NATO anymore. And then similarly a bit with Canada and the 51st state one. Actually, my clear impression is that the opposite has taken place. That both Denmark and Canada have become more interested in talking about the Arctic in NATO, because what that means is that they can now talk about the Arctic in a setting where they know there are several other countries that will agree with them and be opposed to the United States. So it's a sort of a comfortable setting to discuss particularly Arctic security. So this is sort of coming back to my initial, first of all, statement. I'm not going to attempt at a sort of advanced explanation of why Canada chooses to do what it wants, but that the relationship with the United States is quite evidently an important factor in deciding Canadian policy. Now, this brings me to some prospects and possibilities. Lots of busy graph, but it doesn't matter. As in, this is the traditional folk picture, and also now with Norfolk, the sort of the new picture, where you have Northcom and NATO. This is SHAPE, which is the sort of now the operational command in NATO, divided like that, and the high north being up there. If NATO allies were really sort of serious about making putting more emphasis on the Arctic in the alliance, the obvious thing to do would be to link NORAD with Norfolk, and then basically linking the sort of area responsibility, or at least the area where you try and cooperate in building a good maritime and air picture to the whole of the sort of friendly, to call it that, Arctic. Through doing that, you would be able to get a very broad coverage and then probably a very good picture of what goes on in a large part of the Arctic, at least half of the Arctic. But I don't think that's going to happen soon. And again, the explanation is probably Trump and the United States, because countries are becoming more sensitive to sharing stuff, as in sharing information with the United States. But maybe when things calm down a bit, this is sort of something that can be possible. And there are a lot of technical issues and sensitivities involved there, but this is possible. You can always wash pictures and take away things you do not want to share, etc. So that's basically what I've sort of said. You were being very quiet, but now hopefully you'll have lots of questions. Yes, sir.
I have one. It might be a little off topic, but
okay.
I think it's relevant. Where is UNCLOS, the law of the sea treaty? Because part of the issue for Canada was that we maintained that our Arctic islands were littoral areas. And of course, Russia makes claims that far exceed the sort of geographic North Pole. So my first question is that, and the other is, these are quite different kind of areas because our Arctic is littoral. So if you'd like to comment on that.
Yep. First of all, on UNCLOS, the Russian claims in the Arctic have also been primarily as or more or less almost based on UNCLOS as well. As in Russia hasn't sort of come up with any kind of crazy solutions like sort of this 9-dash line that China sort of tries to advance in the South China Sea. What Russia does do is not all that different from what Canada is doing, is because there isn't a clause in UNCLOS as in Article 234 that covers shipping in ice-covered waters, that gives the coastal states certain sort of or greater rights to sort of protect the environment and sort of control shipping in that area. Obviously, the Canadian Arctic is very different, as you say, because it's an archipelago. So it's a different discussion. But also on the Russian side, again, I'm too small, but there are straits along the Northern Sea, because if you follow the Russian coast, Novaya Zemlya there is the first little island under the red. So Russia also has these issues. But now Russia has sort of, I don't have a good map unfortunately here, but they've declared part of the area north of Russia, the Northern Sea route area, and they claim that Russian laws and sort of to go through that you have to pay Russia and you have to sort of other state ships have to notify Russia, etc. And that sort of not doesn't fit easily with the UNCLOS. But again, they're using this sort of ice-covered water article to promote it. So the issues connected to UNCLOS are somewhat similar on both sides, and UNCLOS. But the good thing is that UNCLOS is key, and all countries have adhered to UNCLOS. Even the United States, which has not ratified the treaty, has now claimed the shelf of Alaska, north of Alaska, by pointing to UNCLOS and saying that we consider that customary international law, and that gives us a right to also do the same. And the second question is the differences between the different parts of the Arctic. Canadian Arctic is the cold, North American Arctic is definitely the coldest and where the ice will remain the longest. The European part is by far the warmest because of the warm water that comes up from the Mexican Gulf through the North Atlantic, and this is why it's ice-free. And this is where there's quite a sizable population in the European part of the Arctic, unlike in the North American one. But also, if you go further east into Siberia and the sort of Asian part of the Arctic, you call it that, and Pacific side, then it's much more like the North American Arctic. It's much sort of colder and very hard to access, and very little infrastructure up there. I don't know if that was a good answer, but it was an attempt. Thank you. I think Misha was first in that.
Yeah, I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one, with concern, so you've demonstrated a couple of documents that you've been going through. They mostly pertain to the Western
views.
Views. I was wondering if you're also looking at the Russian documents in your analysis whatsoever, trying to sort of juxtapose those and see how those, whether some possible common denominator,
mm-hmm.
if you want to call it like that, could be found. So this is the first question. The second one is not that sort of a military, but rather commercial nature. When Russia closed its airspace in 2022 for European airlines,
mm-hmm.
some of them started flying over the Arctic. I was wondering if there were some sort of also some cases maybe you follow up with all the sort of territorial misunderstandings, let's put it that way, in place, whether certain airlines were allowed to fly some of those disputed areas or not.
Mm-hmm. To start with the first one, I don't follow Russia very closely, but I should follow it a bit. The key thing with Russia and the Arctic, in my eyes, is that Russia has chosen not to lead the Arctic Council. It could have, because Russia had the chairship, as it's called, in February 2022. And then that was supposed to be, or not even supposed to, it was transferred to Norway in May, 12th of May, I think it even was, in 2023. Yeah. And normally what happens is that you have a ministerial meeting, as the foreign ministers meet, and then you have the sort of transfer of chairship. Now, no foreign minister from the other 7 countries were willing to meet the Russian foreign minister. So Russia could have gone out and said, we want a ministerial meeting, if not, we're leaving, the Arctic Council is dead. They didn't. Yeah. They accepted a digital meeting sort of among the senior Arctic officials, sort of the Arctic ambassadors, to call them that, in these countries. So Russia is clearly interested in keeping the Arctic Council alive, which is a clear pointer to the fact that there are common interests that Russia is interested even in protecting. And the Arctic Council, as also the other Arctic Council members, are very keen to keep the Arctic Council alive. So the Arctic Council is very outside the UN system. It's one of the very, very few bodies where you see a working relationship between Russia and Canada and other countries here. As in the working groups, there is activity, mostly scientific, but still things are going on as in today as well. So if you go back to 2009, the Obama administration, when it wanted to do a reset with Russia, the Arctic was one of the areas who wanted to try a reset. And this is exactly because you have these sort of shared interest in the North, and both in sort of terms of search and rescue and sort of environmental protection, but also in science.
Right.
So as it goes to airlines, I haven't studied that, but for instance, Finnair, Finnish airline, they had big business in taking flights from all of Europe and then to Helsinki and then flying across Russia to Asia. That was their, I think they earned a lot of money on that. Suddenly, they couldn't. So now they have to fly north into the Arctic Ocean and then fly through the Bering Strait, and that takes much longer. But that's basically the route that all companies, all airlines that are not allowed by Russia to fly there have to fly either as an up or south.
Yeah.
So do you fly, I've flown actually from Helsinki south, across here and then Black Sea and around like that. So it's much longer, but depending on the winds and everywhere, they choose different routes.
Yeah.
So that's really all I know about the airlines.
And maybe like also as a quick follow-up on the first question, if my memory serves me right, in the first sort of iterations of Trump's plans to, find ways to, bring Russia in and to be on Ukraine and some other issues. And again, I think the meeting in Anchorage was and also sort of this idea that Arctic might be one of the areas, right? I was wondering if you also were following up on this, how the Americans are trying to use the Arctic as to find some conflict with Russia right now.
Yeah, well, but you look at the 28-point peace plan, that has sort of mentions sort of possible projects in the Arctic as one sort of avenue for increased Russian and United States cooperation. Yeah. But that actually was the case even before, long before Trump. I remember back in 2000 and 2003, when the relations were still friendly, as in Russia wasn't the pariah state it is today, then there was also this notion that the world is running out of oil and gas. This is before shale oil and shale gas and all that and the other. And then Norway had a disputed area with Russia in the Barents Sea. And there was concern in Norway that if the US entered into sort of energy partnership with Russia, that you could sort of get a Russian-US consortium trying to sort of drill for oil and gas in a disputed area, which would have been a big problem for Norway. But that didn't happen. And now, well, we'll see what happens with, who knows, but with Trump. But anyway, the Arctic is definitely an area where there are potential sort of also economic opportunities. And you see this with China as well, and China being interested in resources, but also in shipping. And as the situation is now, with growing Russian dependence on China, maybe China will be able to force Russia to give them sort of increased sort of access, but also sort of allow them to establish stuff in the Arctic that would not necessarily be in Russian interest. Paul?
That's actually the point I wanted to come up to with regards to China and its relationship. I mean, it is very dependent upon Russia currently for access to the Arctic, but presumably Russia doesn't have an interest in expanding China's role. It wants to very much control that access. So do you see that as something, a relationship that's likely to persist beyond the situational dependence that Russia has currently on China during the war?
You're a bigger expert in Russia than me, so I don't know. No, but my sense is that my sense is that as in if Russia could do without China in the Arctic, they would. They would take China's money, definitely, no problem. As in investments on Yamal Peninsula, which is this thing, top one of the red part there. This is where it says Kara Sea. This thing sticking out, that's the Yamal Peninsula, and that's very important for gas production. So there are both pipelines going, but also for export of liquefied natural gas, LNG. And there you have quite some Chinese investment. That's one of the areas with biggest Chinese investments in the Arctic. But if like sort of this is the sort of the both in a sort of a national sort of feeling or whatever, national sort of mythology, if you want to call it that sense, as the Arctic and Siberia sort of has a place in Russian thinking, as you know much better than me. But also it's very important economic resources for Russia, which means that they do not want to give this away to China free. And again, as you know better, there's this concern in Russia that China will take over Siberia because it's empty and all the thousands and millions of Chinese will come up and take over is something that has been there for a long time. Now, when it comes to military activity, there's sort of sometimes people sort of write about or talk about sort of China wanting to have a military presence in the Arctic, including sending sort of strategic submarines up there. I don't think that's, first of all, I don't see why they want to do that. I can imagine that the United States can count the number of fish that sail through the Bering Strait. That's probably one of the most sort of surveilled or sort of, I'm sure they have a lot of intelligence resources in that area. But also, as in Russia would not want Chinese submarines sailing around its strategic submarines. Because if they do, then China would know where they are, and if there was a conflict with China, they could just sink them. So it's really a marriage of convenience, and now perhaps increasingly Russia being forced, or potentially at least being forced by China to make concessions in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Anyone else? Yes, good. Go on.
How did you know I had a question?
No,
you just kept looking at me.
You were looking active, so that's go on.
I'm curious about you mentioned the Arctic Council and some of these like minor agreements. I know it was more of like a scientific forum that they were being used. We talked about this in Misha's class. I'm curious, Norway's agreement, the fishery agreement between Russia and Norway.
Yep.
Recently there was like I think Russia gave a ultimatum to that agreement because there was like sanctions on something involving that. Do you still believe in Arctic exceptionalism with regards to certain things and not others? And like, I'm kind of just wondering about, is there a place for these like small agreements that will benefit like regulation and things like scientific exchange, or like, is there now, have we crossed a line where that's like no longer possible?
No, I definitely think there's a place. I think I partly answered it in a sense with the fact that the Arctic Council is still alive. Mm-hmm. But just to pick up on the fisheries agreement, Norway is very keen to keep that alive because the fish. Let's see if I can make this back better. If I can go back. Oh, okay. Let's see. Can you go back to go away a few things here? Probably not. No, back. Okay, there you go. Stay there. Basically, the Bering Sea and this area here is very rich in fish. As in the stock now is sustainable. As in the fisheries they're sustainable fisheries, and the basis for that is the sort of cooperation between Norway and Soviet Union initially, and then Russia, stretching back to 1970s, 1974, I think, was the first sort of fishery agreement, and it's sort of basically Norway and Russian scientists come together and they sort of agree on this, or the sort of the sizes of the different, mainly 4 different species they regulate, and then a quota is set based on the scientific evidence, and then it's given to Norway and Russia, and then a few other countries, as in based on historical rights. So for a long time it was the EU that had most of it, as in countries in the EU, and then when Britain, as in Brexit, then there was a big mess because we would get what based on historical rights. But anyway, so Britain has some as well, but that is the basis. Now, with the sanctions that came after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Norway was, in a sense, obliged to close all that cooperation as well, but it didn't. It kept even 4 Norwegian ports open for, as in Russian trawlers that could come to Norwegian ports and deliver their fish and sort of get paid for that, because it's more interesting for Russian fishermen to come to Norwegian port and get more money for their fish. And that was related, sort of restricted to 2 ports. I think only 2 ports they can come now. But that was done because Norway wanted to preserve this as in cooperation. And it's not just Norway, as in the Faroe Islands, also they allow Russian fishermen to land their fish there. And it's also a local economic sort of interest in the sense that the local fish industry wants this fish as well. So there is search and rescue as well is an area where there is still contact between Norway and Russia. If something happens, then as in we need to save lives, then all kinds of other things will be sort of put aside, and they will cooperate to try and save people at sea, etc. And that goes both ways. The concern in Norway is that because of the warming water, the fish will migrate probably, and it probably will migrate eastwards. If it migrates completely into the Russian economic zone, then Russia will no longer have an incentive to cooperate with Norway. And that will be difficult, because then Russia could say, no, we'll keep our stock to ourselves and keep running Norway out, and then Norway would have a problem. But that's in the future, but not now. Yeah, we'll come back to you, Misha. But
No problem.
yeah,
I think it is obvious that Trump wants to increase the U.S. influence in both Canada and Greenland. It's related to economic-oriented goals. But do you think he has also some military-oriented goals in the Arctic, and that's why he wants to increase the U.S. influence in both Canada and Greenland?
First of all, I think there's no sensible basis for these claims, but yes, as in the argument that has been made is particularly connected to Pacific, as in this space base, the big radar in Greenland. That is very important for the United States. But the United States did not need to own Greenland to have access there. As in if the United States went to Denmark and Greenland and said, we want to establish another military base in Greenland, that was a fine. Come. As long as you sort of don't ruin the environment or whatever. But as in same thing with mining, which is sort of the main economic driver on Greenland, as in the rare earths and everything. If a US company wanted to set up business on Greenland, I'm 100% sure the Greenlandic government would say, yeah, please come. They've had offers from China and declined those because they don't want China to do it, but I'm sure they would take the US money and investments. So, and again, in Canada, it's sort of what possible, as in, I'm sure Canada would allow the United States, as in the whole discussion with Golden Dome now, etc. I'm sure the Canadian government will allow the United States to invest in necessary air defense radars and wherever in Canada, unless they push too hard and sort of talk too much about the 51st state. Then you might, as in, you can answer that, but I imagine that people say no, go away. So I don't see why, as in, yes, there is some economic interest in U.S. economic interest in the Arctic, and there's U.S. defense interest in the Arctic, but I don't see those as any kind of, in a rational way, connected to needing to have these countries or the areas out there. If that was a good answer to your question.
The one thing that I think that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation is, what about other countries that aren't necessarily in the Arctic? And you know, at the bottom of the map is the Isles of Skye and parts of Scotland.
Yep.
How involved are the UK in these discussions? Are they involved at all?
Yep.
And what about their fishing rights? Because they've historically had conflict with Iceland over fishing rights.
Yep. On fishing, if I understood it and remember it right, the British fishing fleet is not that active in the north anymore, because I think they gave away some quota to the European Union. But that's sort of, but traditionally and also now Britain is very interested in the North Atlantic, and you see also in NATO you see Britain wanting to get in on the discussion on the Arctic, because these Arctic 7 nations, they sort of have twice now, as in last year and this spring, sort of cooperated and made these what they call non-papers or food for thought papers, that where they sort of present their collective thoughts to the other allies. And I know Britain has been very keen to come in on that, but they're not necessarily welcomed in, because the Arctic countries want to keep this as something they do together and not involve Britain. For Britain, the area, as in Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, etc., is clearly tied to British security, because the most simple part is that if Russian submarines come south here and start sort of sailing around the British Isles, the British strategic deterrent, as in their strategic submarines, are stationed in Scotland. And Britain does not want Russian submarines figuring out where these are. So that's a sort of defense and security interest. But also, Britain has sort of had a traditional leading role, to call it that, in Northern Europe. And given that global Britain hasn't been quite the success they hoped for, this is sort of an area where they can actually be a big power and sort of lead. And if you've heard of the Joint Expeditionary Force, Jeff, yeah, that's sort of their vehicle for engaging with the countries in the region in security and defense.
If I can ask just a quick follow-up, are we seeing similar discussions about build-up of strategic infrastructure in the north of Scotland from Britain as we are, say, in Canada or the US?
Not that I know of, no, I don't think so. But Britain is obviously now, like most NATO countries, sort of eager to sort of spend a lot of defense and show that they're being good allies. So what you have, though, is a similar discussion to the one in Canada is Denmark, particularly in Greenland, but also on the Faroe Islands. They're sort of trying to be good allies and show that they're taking security and defense on Greenland very seriously by investing a lot of money. Like in northern Canada, no one is ever going to, in that sense, any sensible person will not invade Greenland or northern Canada. You probably heard the famous quote by the Canadian Chief of Defence in 2008-9, as an Antinchik, he was called. He said that if anyone invades Canada in the north, my first task would be to go up and rescue them, because that would be not very sensible. So yeah, and it's not like what Trump says, sort of the Russian and Chinese ships are sailing around in sort of rows around Greenland. They're not. So, but Denmark is sort of doing this to sort of show that they take Greenland and Greenlandic security seriously. You haven't asked a question. You sort of, yes, go ahead.
Given like the main shipping route between Europe is like to the US, how impactful is Canada in NATO's interests?
Mm-hmm. Can you go back to where you have the sea lines?
You should be able to.
Yeah, maybe I should do it. Can do it. That's it. Oh yeah, I can do it. We'll go back to this map. Canada. Traditionally, this has been a very important Canadian role. As in going back to the World War II as well, Canada was important in sort of supporting and protecting these sea lines of communication. And again, I'm not in any way an expert in Canadian foreign policy and defense policy, but the emphasis being placed on maritime and air in Canada now, for instance, buying this new maritime surveillance aircraft, the P-8, is a sign that this is becoming important for Canada. It is definitely the area where Canada can make a difference and support sort of joint allied effort in keeping track and unwanted submarines, put it like that, and protect these sea lines communications if needed. And it's not just this, isn't it? I haven't talked about it, but another very important aspect, but a part of this are the sort of the fiber optic cables and other sort of undersea infrastructure that goes across the Atlantic, because Russia does have special purpose submarines, but they can use to go out and destroy these. So keeping track of those submarines and then keeping track of and protecting this sort of what is called critical undersea infrastructure is very important. And the going back to, was it the December of 22 or 23 when they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic Sea? That was an eye-opener for very many, including in Norway, that so this undersea infrastructure is vulnerable. It turned out it wasn't a Russian sort of attack on that, but it was probably Ukrainians, what I gathered. But still, it shows that these types of infrastructure can be attacked, and we are very dependent on them. So this is somewhere where Canada can play a role.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me actually that there was German submarines that made their way into the St. Lawrence River.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably to, I don't know what they did ever, maybe to surface and then sort of have shelter for a while. Now, Misha, I'm sorry, you haven't. Yeah, go ahead. Just do the first one.
In terms of Russian access to the North Atlantic and through the Baltic, is there much? There's been a lot of things going on in the Baltic Sea with environmental stuff and on cables, ships driving cables.
Yeah. We dropped our anchor.
Oh, I dropped our anchor. We drove for 100 kilometers. Didn't notice we had the anchor out. Are there environmental concerns on the Norwegian coast about Russian second-rate tankers taking oil
definitely.
out?
Yeah, definitely. This shadow fleet, which is sort of really bad old sort of whatever, not up to standard tankers that they can get a hold of to, definitely, because they sail from the St. Petersburg area and then out through the Danish Straits and up like that, as in the summer months, and when the ice is open, that they sail through the Arctic. And particularly in the Arctic, there is no infrastructure. If one of those runs aground and sort of spills all the oil, there's nothing there. It's going to be a massive environmental impact. So definitely that part is something that is being followed very closely. The problem is the lack of legal instruments to actually do something about this. Unless they sail into territorial waters, you can't really do anything. As far as I'm not an international lawyer, but I understand that there are no instruments that we've found yet, at least, that we can stop them. So the main emphasis I know now is looking at to do something in the Baltic Sea, because then they are at least sort of passed through sort of territorial waters, and then you could perhaps come up with something. But if they sail out in open ocean here in high seas, then it's hard to touch them.
So is the straits between Denmark and Sweden, is that international?
Yeah, that's an international.
Is that international waters?
Yeah, that's international strait in the UNCLOS.
So you can sail through that.
Yeah, that's the whole debate with Canada and US
no
law.
restrictions.
No, that's in Denmark. Not. It's considered sort of UNCLOS does open for sort of important, like Gibraltar Strait and a few other. But these are international straits that the coastal state must allow free passage. So, again, as I understand it, there are no international legal instruments to actually do something about this, which is unfortunate, but that's how it is. So, maybe I'm going to be brutal, and maybe it would be good to have a Trump over there, because he doesn't seem to care about international law, so, well, Venezuela, etc. But I think Misha was first and then you.
I know, I have so many questions. I'm not sure if I can ask all of them, but the one that I wanted to ask is as a follow-up to the undersea infrastructure in the Atlantic that you mentioned. And that Russia does have capabilities to potentially severe them, we hear all that, but it hasn't happened so far, from what I know. So the question is, does it have to do with the plausible deniability absence, so to say? Because if something happens, all the lights will come to Russia. Like, we know Russia is the only one who can do that.
Yeah.
Or does it have to do with a sort of a terrain, geography, where it's really difficult to do that, because Russia does not know exactly where they are? So that's the first question. The second question for you, being based in Norway, my original question concerning Svalbard or Spitsbergen.
Yeah, Svalbard.
Russians call it, right? I mean, you hear every now and then in the media that they celebrate 9th of May parade there or something like that, but like beyond all of that, propagandistic, flow. If like look at like everyday operations of a zero, like Russians living there, is there some sort of understanding there still that yes, we understand the war is happening there, but we need to survive here on the ground somehow? How has that been like in the recent years?
Okay. Yeah. On your first question was why hasn't Russia attacked critical undersea infrastructure? I think the question, the answer is the same as you sort of can see in other parts of NATO, and particularly Poland. Why hasn't Russia done more to attack the supply lines into Ukraine? Well, because this is my sort of take on that is they're afraid to expand the conflict with NATO. They do not want to.
Deterrence.
Yeah, they particularly if they go after the cables and pipelines, deep waters, everyone knows it's only Russia can do this. Okay. And then you would have a reaction. So the general impression of not so much perhaps as in, but also here, but even more so in the north, is that Russia is being careful. As in Russian provocative behavior in the north has decreased since February 2022.
What could be a response? There's all this talk about escalation management and all that, right? I mean, people know that there's not going to be direct war with Russia if they cut a cable somewhere.
Well, if Russia goes too far, then something will happen. As in, there's a limit to how much NATO countries can accept. So, but yeah, as in, it's difficult. But there are, as in, they could, as one. That would be controversial, but they could close off the Danish Strait and just basically prevent Russian vessels and Russian-owned vessels from going there. That would hurt Russia really badly, and it would be not according to international law, but it could be based on a sort of some reaction to sort of Russia doing something that, an attack.
I mean, most of the Russian shadow fleet ships, they go through those islands, so they'll pretty much block the exports of oil.
Yeah, it would. So, and on Svalbard, just to do that, as in there, obviously you probably know also the historical background, as in the Svalbard Treaty meant that the archipelago, also all the islands were given, that are covered by that treaty, were given to Norway, and it's sort of sovereign Norwegian lands, or sort of territory. But then there are certain limitations on the exercise of Norwegian sovereignty. And one of this is the equal treatment of all signatory parties when it comes to economic activity. This is why we have Barentsburg, as in the Russian mining settlement on Svalbard. And there is contact, but not that much. But as in the Norwegian governor and the sort of Norwegian police, to call it that, on Svalbard does go into Barentsburg, and if something happened, they will investigate. So my impression is that the relations are sort of functional, and there is a sort of understanding that we have to live together and sort of do that, and that a lot of the sort of hoisting of the Soviet flag and the 9th May parade and all sort of other things like that has much to do with the Russian governor, or the chair of the director of Arctic, which is the Russian company that sort of basically runs the town. He's an activist and he wants to be seen, show himself. And so he organizes these things properly with the intent of becoming visible in Moscow and getting somewhere. I don't know. That's at least one interpretation of it. So, but so far, everything is there hasn't been anything spectacular going on Svalbard. But this is an area where it's very easy for Russia to challenge Norway if they want to. And one of the scenarios is that as in Russians in Barentsburg said, well, the Norwegian governor and the police, they're mistreating us. So please send police forces from Russia to protect us. That's going to be the challenge for Norway. That's going to be difficult to do anything about. How do you respond to that? You send soldiers?
Well, we've got a question from the online audience.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, let me do that. Yeah, thank you.
This is from Nicole Covey, who asks, Canada has long been concerned about the Arctic turning into a scenario in which it was the Western Seven against Russia, although they have been quiet about this topic since it came true. Now that the like-minded Seven have been solidified due to NATO expansion, can you speak to the European reaction/concerns about how the new NATO 7 may transform the Arctic geopolitical theater?
Oh, that's a difficult one, I guess. But I think, first of all, I think one should not overestimate how much the Arctic 7 can actually do on their own in the Arctic. Because most of the legal instruments and the governance instruments they have used to govern, also make changes to the sort of to the Arctic, have been through the UN system or in terms of international agreements where they also include other countries. Because just the Arctic 7 countries agreeing to do something will not be binding on other countries. So just to use some examples, as in the Polar Code, which is a sort of a regulation that sort of puts requirements on vessels that are supposed, as in there are to go through polar waters, as in either through the Arctic Ocean or sail across to Antarctica. The work on that was sort of initiated to some sense in the Arctic Council, but it was grounded, and the actual regulation came through the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body, and through that it becomes applicable for all countries in the world. Same thing where there's in 2017 or 18, I forget which year anyway, there's an agreement on a moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. And that was signed by China, by the EU, and by a range of other countries to make it, again, it wouldn't have helped if just the Arctic states had signed this. You want the other sort of big countries to be in on this, and the EU as well. That was a very easy agreement to sign because there is no fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. It's covered by ice, so there's no fish there. But in a sense, it's a good sort of agreement, because in case this were sort of to open up, then at least there is a legal basis for preventing fishing there. So to try and answer the question, there haven't, as far as I know, there hasn't been sort of reactions in Europe to sort of the Arctic 7 sort of cooperating more. Other than that, there are some countries like the UK that we touched on that really want to be in on this, but are being kept a bit on the outside because they're not an Arctic country. That was a long-winded answer to a difficult question. But so you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wondered what the general view you would think in Norway and some of the northern countries about those cargoes from Yamal. Is the eastern trajectory of most of them an artifact of the war, or do you think, in other words, do you think that there would be increased traffic through the Arctic area from Yamal in the event of that hostilities were lessened?
Mm-hmm. Well, first keeping sort of the hostilities part out. So as of still, the traffic from Yamal goes mainly to Europe or out into the North Atlantic during winter, because in winter you have to have heavy icebreaker support all the way if they want to go through the Arctic. In the ice-free period, which is now it's growing increasingly long, so it's like the end of July or whatever, and until more or less beginning of October or something now, they can sail eastwards, and then they take LNG from Yamal to China. There is still import in Europe, as in Belgium and Spain, and I think at least those two, and I think maybe some other countries also as still import from Russia. But I think that as in gradually the EU is trying to force them to sort of stop doing that and import it from elsewhere, which will remove much of that market from Russia as well. So they'll become more reliant on going the other way, which will become a problem for them because in winter it's difficult to export. More traffic in times of conflict? Well, potentially, but also if there is a conflict, a war between NATO and Russia, and the United States decides to prevent them from going through the Bering Strait, then they will have a problem. That's a pretty narrow strait, and it's pretty shallow as well. So they probably wouldn't be able to go through there. So in that sense, it is problematic to export from the Arctic, because you either have to, in this way it's easy, but the other way it's the ice and the strait that is sort of you have to get through or sort of overcome if you want to export from there to China. And obviously also the volume is an issue. It's much easier to export big volumes through pipelines than on LNG ships. So this is why you've had these plans to build long pipelines from the Yamal and down through Russia to China. And this probably Paul knows more about than me, but I don't think much has come out of that.
I think you're right about that, because Russia announced the power of Siberia 2 was going ahead while they were in China. China was completely silent on it. It's not in Mongolia's 5-year plan. So,
yeah, there you go.
You know, so.
Yeah, no big plans, but yeah. And Russia really wants to sort of get the Northern Sea route going, because that would be a source of income for them, because they would charge ships going through the Northern Sea route area. But so far, there hasn't been an international interest. And since 2014, very few European or Western companies have gone through there. And after 2022, even China, as in the big Chinese shipping companies, have stopped going through. So there's a big Chinese company called COSCO, not to be confused with but I think they had 26 transshipments through the Arctic in 2021, and from 2022, zero, nothing. And they'd come up with there's a new shipping line, it's called, that has been specifically sort of created for this kind of traffic. And they do a lot of sort of, they only sail from Russia to Chinese ports. And it was one of their ships, this new Polar Bear, that dragged this anchor and sort of tore off the cable in the Finnish Bay. So thirdly, also Chinese companies are afraid of secondary sanctions and the reaction in the West if they go through the Russian Arctic and through the North Sea route and then pay Russia to do so. Yes?
You were talking about how it would be very strategically sound to increase kind of combine Norfolk and NORAD, but it's kind of challenging to do with Trump at the moment. Is there ways that these two organizations can kind of like get the ball rolling on this, like, and be like, okay, we're gonna wait out the Trump presidency, but like have these like kind of micro agreements or like steps that can be taken that are like, I don't want to say Trump-proof, I don't have a better word for it right now, but like, is there like baby steps that can be taken now so that like, you know, maybe down the road when there's more options, it's kind of.
Yeah, no, I think so, yeah. But it would require that lower level as in from Canada and from the US agree on doing this. As in, one is to just exchange air picture. As in, because in NATO, let's see. The NATO area, as in air surveillance and air policing in NATO is a NATO task. So in Europe, if a Russian fighter comes, or a Russian bomber comes out here, Norway will send out 2 fighters from Evenes, an airbase up here. And those are under NATO command, 24/7, 365 days a year. Same thing further south, as in, there are, as most NATO countries have fighters on readiness that are under NATO command all the time. So there is what is called a recognized air picture in NATO that is shared among sort of NATO allies. I presume there's the same thing as in that NORAD NORTHCOM has a sort of recognized air picture. Those could be exchanged. That's not a big deal. And you can even wash them, as if Canada and the United States didn't want to share everything. They just sort of say, oh, we don't share these things, but we'll let everyone see what else goes on. That could be a very simple sort of way of exchanging. And actually, there is actually a link in the way of a person today, because the commander of Joint Force Command Norfolk is in a his US hat is as commander of 2nd Fleet, which is Northcom's fleet on the East Coast. So, as in, he has 2 bosses, commander there. One is Secure, the NATO commander, and the second one is commander, I forget what it's called now. He has a 4-star admiral that is under Northcom as his US boss. So there's a link, and that could be useful.
Was that on purpose? Like, was that done on purpose, or was it just kind of like?
Yeah, partly at least, yeah. So it complicates things a bit, because this means that this is a 3-star general, or admiral rather, whereas the 2 other similar commands in NATO are 4-star. So it's a bit complex, but it is because the United States stood up 2nd Fleet and then offered to sort of combine that with Joint Force Command Norfolk. So it is by design, but yeah. But that's one way of sort of starting and just linking this. And you can also link maritime pictures. That it would need to be sort of okayed by the Canadian and the US government, but it doesn't have to be anything so spectacular. It can be done, yeah. It's being done with other countries. Before Finland and Sweden joined NATO, there was a sort of air defense picture exchange agreements. So basically, Finland and Sweden would give their air picture to NATO, and NATO would give their the other way around. But again, you would wash it, just to take away the parts that you didn't want the others to see. So, in the back there.
Yeah, so we talked about the potential for sabotage conducted by primarily the potential for civilian fleets, but also military sabotage. There's obviously a big potential for intelligence gathering and espionage as well.
Yep.
How has NATO managed that, and also more specifically, how does Norway manage that?
Counterintelligence and intelligence is not really something that countries in NATO cooperate much about. A bit, but not that much. So that's much more a national responsibility, and if there is cooperation, it's generally in smaller groups. So like Five Eyes being the sort of most famous example. So as in, from a NATO perspective, what you would do is you would track sort of known Russian intelligence assets, like they have these intelligence ships, AGIs they call, and they sail around and they track them, and so always have in their briefings that, oh, this is a Russian ship here. And Norway does the same. But Norway obviously, let's see, we can go back. Yeah, oops. Because of geography, and because there is lots going on, and Russia tests a lot of maritime weapons in other in the news, for instance, recently there was this Burevestnik, as in the sort of nuclear propelled cruise missile that was tested on the ISM. Yeah. You would not be surprised to know that, to sort of think that, well, it wouldn't be surprising to think that Norway follows that very closely. Because this is good currency in the international intelligence exchange. And because Norway is where it is, it's easy. As in we have intelligence ships, they sail up and they follow this. And then they come to the Americans and say, oh, we have something interesting here. We want to change? Yeah. So there, but also obviously on the intelligence threat, there's a lot of sort of a heightened awareness in, I'd imagine, most European countries. And there have been several issues in Norway, and just take one. In the good old, as in 10 years back, and when we were still good friends, or more or less good friends, and well, at least normal relations with Russia, a lot of Russian sailors came to work in Norway. And they sort of became captains on the sort of local ships, etc., and gained sort of certificates. They were allowed to sail in all of it. That has now become an issue. And sort of, are we sure we want sort of, we want to vet these, that then suddenly, if a conflict with Russia came, suddenly sort of said, oh, we're not selling anymore. Or suddenly my ship sank. Something happened. So these kinds of things have come much more into attention since February 22, and than they were before. And the same is this case with China, and this growing awareness that, well, maybe we shouldn't use Huawei in our communication systems, etc. Anything more online? Or?
Nope.
No? Misha has another one.
Yeah. Well,
if people are wanting, I can say. If not, we'll continue over beer afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, last one. So you mentioned the cheap bombers, right? And we hear about them every now and then. So those, I assume, happen unannounced. So it's like testing the defenses, right, and the resilience, how fast.
When they fly out?
Yeah.
There's a regular, also a schedule that, and they fly now and then. Yeah.
Okay, but so there's more or less an expectation when they would come. So that part is clear. But one of the slides that you showed is there's this, I don't know how you correctly pronounce it, Juke line.
Juke, yeah.
Yeah, Juke, correct. I mean, everyone knows about the Slovakia gap, right?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering. This is honestly, like, I think the first time
that
I've heard about. Is this also considered to be like a gap in NATO defenses, really? Potentially, like Slovakia, like do they talk about it?
There are many gaps, you see, and it's become a sport. In the old days, in the Cold War, you had the Fulda gap.
Yeah, the Fulda gap.
Yeah. And then you have the Georg gap. And then you got the Slovakia gap. And now Norway has come up with the Bear gap, which is here.
Bear gap.
Yeah, because there's a Bear Island here. So it's from the Norwegian mainland through via that island up to Svalbard, and that's the Bear gap. And the Norwegian argument that is that instead of having the sort of forward line of defense here, which puts Norway beyond the forward line of defense, which is not a very nice place to be, then NATO should have its forward line of defense here. And basically, if you want to stop submarines from getting into the deep water here, you have to track them, or at least get track of them here, and then
where
stop
it's
them.
shallow.
Yeah, where it's shallow. So there are many of those gaps. I forgot your question.
No, I mean it's a question concerning if it's considered to be a gap and what has been done about it. So you
and during us, and this is also publicly known, and during the Cold War, the United States and Britain and others invested a lot into sort of surveillance cabinets, Suez cables, as basically acoustic cables that put on the seafloor that can pick up any kind of noise from whales or submarines.
I mean, Russians tried to install some of them. There was I think like last year, maybe even this year, there was a piece of news that said that there were some sensors detected off the coast of the United Kingdom that Russians installed.
Okay, I haven't heard that.
To try the movement of.
Now this is why Britain doesn't want Russian submarines, undetected Russian submarines, lurking around there. Same in Ireland as well, actually. A lot of these transatlantic fiber cables go from Ireland, for obvious reasons, over here. So Ireland has also started to cooperate with NATO on sort of protecting these.
On the last slide where you have the map,
this one.
yeah, over by Ottawa, I noticed you have a favorite.
Oh yeah. See? Well spotted. Little heart in Ottawa. I'm happy to stay, and if there are more questions.
A few more minutes, if there's other
Yeah.
questions.
Anything more online or?
No?
No?
Can I ask
No?
a question?
Yes, go ahead.
This is, sorry, I keep coming back to
Yeah, no.
this cooperation and stuff like that. In terms of like engaging with like the indigenous populations
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the Arctic,
Yeah.
obviously before like the Arctic Council was like super important for that.
Mm.
And I know that like relations between like the Kremlin and indigenous populations in this area have undergone recent troubles, to say the least.
Yeah.
But like, do you picture this being a policy priority for NATO? Like, I know that it's like, at what point are we like balancing like our liberal values, including like, you know, environmentalism and like indigenous rights, and at what point do we start like kind of building military infrastructure in these areas? I mean, Canada is kind of doing like it's dual use infrastructure, so you know that's good for northern communities.
Yep.
Otherwise, we wouldn't build there. But you know,
Yep.
now that it's NATO,
Yep.
like not to show the government, but like, so do you picture this being like a policy priority, and like whether we'll be able to maintain this despite like you know maybe future aggression risks with Russia and the United States?
Two-part answer. One is related to the money. And sort of the new 5% where 1.5% is supposed to be infrastructure related. I don't know, is everyone familiar with this? As in, because you had a 2% target for defense spending in NATO, and then Trump became president, so I want 5%. Now the problem with 5% is the United States is not spending 5% on defense. So someone had to come up with a good solution. So the solution was 3.5% traditional defense spending, which is by chance exactly what the United States is, and then 1.5% defense related. And this is where this sort of building infrastructure dual use in the north in Canada can easily be fitted into this, saying that there is a defense use for this support or whatever, so we can sort of spend money on that and then be a good ally in NATO and sort of So and that's the same for Norway as well. As in Norway can now build better bridges and railways and whatever in the north, and saying this is defense related and we're fulfilling the 1.5 part of our commitments, and it's good for the local population as well. Now when it comes to indigenous populations, that's very important in the Arctic Council, less so in NATO. It's not really a sort of particular issue in NATO. And again, bashing the Americans, it will not become that now. Even gender is sort of in NATO now. That was sort of 1325, as in the UN resolution on gender, etc. That after a long time been a big issue in NATO. Now it's not an issue.
So again, it's coming back to like the UN mechanisms that we've lost, like in the last like couple bit, like because you said that like it's kind of contingent on like the UN things with like gender have also been abandoned. Like, are we linking this kind of disregard for on the U.S. side with like the indigenous rights? Like now they're no longer following that like UN obligation. Yeah,
that would be, so we could say that the U.S. is not doing that. But my point is more that in the Arctic Council, this will probably remain important because you have the permanent participants, which are the indigenous populations in the Arctic Council. So there's a chance at least, unless the United States becomes really difficult in presenting this. Now the problem with Russia is that Russia has also participation in these, amongst other in a sort of united Sami representation, that is sort of the Sami community in Norway, Sweden and Finland and Russia. And that has been problematic now because of Kremlin's policies, because the representatives that come from Russia come with, the war in Ukraine is very good. Because they've been instructed to just say so. So at least I know in that setting it's problematic. And that could be a problem for the sort of representation of indigenous peoples in the Arctic Council. NATO, I said, I don't think you shouldn't bet on that being an issue in NATO. It's more important than 1.5% issue. But again, it's much more, in these issues, it's much more up to the individual countries. And here in Canada, it's very important. It's sort of making sense by just being here a week. It's you forgot to say thank you to the local, when you started the seminar.
Land exam.
Yeah. There you go.
Why is he calling you up for this?
I don't know. We should talk about that.
That's just as a sign of how important it is here.
Yeah.
Mm. This is unthinkable, as in not unthinkable. This would not happen. As in Norway, you would not, even if you're in the north, you would not say thank you to the local. It's a different tradition. It's sort of, yeah, it's different. But here it is very important, and in many ways it's good. But for foreigners like me, it's like, oh, a bit strange. Yeah.
On that note, I think we've run out of time, but please join me in thanking Professor Hilde for sharing today.
For coming and for asking good questions. Much more fun.